Hey, Wits and Weights family. Today's episode is a little different. We're going behind the scenes of the show based on my appearance and conversation on the Mics to Millions podcast with Sambreak Gia, discussing how Wits and Weights has evolved to better serve you. Now, as an engineer, I apply the same systematic approach to this podcast that we use to optimize your fitness. And in this interview, you'll hear how I've refined our content, chosen guests, and used your feedback to shape the show. So whether you're here to build muscle, to lose fat, to optimize your health, this episode gives you some of those insights into the mechanics behind delivering evidence-based, no-nonsense fitness advice. And of course, if you enjoy this type of behind-the-scenes content, just reach out to me on Instagram at Wits and Weights, or send me a text message using the link in the show notes, because your feedback helps us shape the future episodes of the show. All right, let's dive into this bonus episode and get to know the inner workings of the Wits and Weights podcast.
My guest today is the host of Wits and Weights, a podcast that cuts through the noise and deconstructs health and fitness with an engineering mindset to help you develop a strong, lean physique without wasting time. The show receives roughly 20,000 monthly listeners, and it's been running since November 2021. Outside of podcasting, he's also a go-to nutrition and lifestyle coach for high-performing professionals, which has earned him the name The Physique Engineer. And he's also the owner and head coach of Wits and Weights Nutrition Coaching. He's helped countless individuals in their 30s, 40s, and beyond transform their physiques by building muscle, losing fat, breaking through plateaus, and optimizing their hormones and metabolism without restrictive diets, excessive cardio, and boring workouts. Phil Pate, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, man. I can listen to your voice all day, Sam.
Thank you so much. I think everyone, funnily enough, doesn't like the sound of their own voice, and I was exactly the same. And I found out recently or previously that it's actually scientific. There's a reason behind it, which is just science level, why we don't like it. Having people compliment my voice definitely gives me courage and confidence to pursue this career. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, man. Imposter syndrome is rife in this industry, and there's always something you're going to find to dislike about yourself. I do as well. And you're right. The more you do it and put yourself out there, we hopefully people recognize the effort behind it as well.
Mm-hmm. What has been the biggest challenge and greatest highlight of your podcasting journey so far?
The biggest challenge, probably the same thing I tell my clients, is having patience. Having patience, because this is it's a long form content that doesn't have the instant gratification of going viral on social media with that reel or that remix that you did. And you're trying to make the quality, high content, relevant. You're trying to please not everybody, but just the right people. And then you don't want to get burned out, through the whole process. People don't understand. It takes, especially when you start, it takes hours and hours just to do one episode when you first get started, from prep and research to recording to editing. And then you don't see any results for months, if not years, depending on how much effort you're putting in and what kind of podcast and all those characteristics, luck sometimes. So it took a while before anything started to show from it. And I just had to keep going and put it in the reps. That's the biggest challenge. Just like going to the gym. It's you don't see the results right away, but you will eventually.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say would be the greatest highlight that you got out of that or out from podcasting so far?
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because it's not the numbers, it's not the results like downloads, and it's when somebody says, "Hey, your podcast changed my life." Hey, I had type 2 diabetes and everything I tried wasn't working, but you mentioned, going for walks after meals, or you mentioned strength training, and I got into it and I started tracking my food, and then all of a sudden my numbers are great, and now I'm encouraged that I'm going to live 20 more years. I mean, that's so rewarding. Even just one or two of those a year would be rewarding. And I get to hear it pretty frequently when people actually reach out for the podcast. So it's great.
Yeah, I think the word you said there, rewarding, I think that sums it up perfectly. How did Wits and Weights first begin?
It was a passion project. It was me, a guy who loves to talk. And I've been in Toastmasters for many years. That's a nonprofit speaking organization, which helps not only get rid of your ums and ahs, but also become a little more confident for a guy who was an introvert for many years. And so I took my love of speaking and communicating with something that I had gone through over the previous year and a half before I started my show, which was a personal physical transformation, getting stronger, building muscle, losing some fat, and all of that, and doing it in a way that was like a light bulb moment for me. I said, I got to share this with folks. So I started in late 2021, just talking about strength training. And it wasn't probably until a year later, so I added nutrition, and now I'm mostly focused on nutrition, but it's a little of both. So yeah, it was a passion project, and the coaching came much later when I saw that there was a need and people demanding it, which I think is a nice natural way to have done it. And I just love to keep doing it. 3 episodes a week now, keep cranking.
That's a really high output. So we can get into that definitely when we talk about the podcast production. But I want to talk more about the steps you took to get here. You said it was quite slow, or at least podcasting is, we know it's a slow process. Do you know when you first got to 10,000 listeners overall for your podcast?
Yeah, I looked at the graph. It took about 14 months. So I started in October, and then the following December, 10K. And then it was like 4 months to get to 20, and then another couple months to get to 30, and it started to accelerate from there.
Well, I appreciate you coming with data, because a lot of time I ask that and people might be like, I don't know. And it's really nice to hear a tangible answer there.
Oh, you got to know your numbers.
Yeah.
Anybody listening who has a podcast, you got to know your numbers.
Yeah. I love that saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. And with regards to like promoting your show, promoting Wits and Weights, what have you found to be some of the best ways to get it out into the world and reach new audiences and get listeners?
Man, I'll admit promoting podcast is not the easiest thing in the world, because when you try to promote things through social media or advertising or something like that, it just doesn't seem to jive necessarily with the listener that would also listen to podcasts. And so I finally, after knocking my head on the wall after all these months or years, realized collaborating with others and networking and word of mouth is honestly the best way to grow your podcast. And it also is the best way to get on podcasts and the best way to network. And it kind of all feeds into itself like a virtuous cycle. So you can't be a hermit, you can't be just in a tunnel. You got to go out and talk to other podcasters, like Sam here. Whether it's in your space or not, you're going to find very fascinating overlaps between different industries, niches, and categories. And that's the way for you to get out and borrow other audiences and share your audience. And it's like a win-win situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely win-win is the best way of putting it. And with regards to these like swaps that you're doing, how do you initiate them? How do you find the people? What's your process for in getting them?
Yeah, I think you should just be yourself and make the request, but always lead with value. So for me, there's a couple ways that happens. One way is I get pitched a lot now. So one side effect of like growing your podcast is you get a lot of pitches, and a lot of them are terrible. And I know we'll get into this, like what a good pitch looks like. But occasionally I'll get someone that comes along, even if it is through a PR agency, and they're like, look, I have so-and-so, and I will take a look at if they have a show, if they have a podcast, and if their audience is well aligned, I'll say, yeah, sure, I'd love to have them on my show, and I would love to do a swap. It's not a quid pro quo. It's not like you have to do it, but that's worked out quite a few times, especially with people much bigger than me, who they come on my show because they're doing the PR press circuit. And then I'm like, your audience could benefit if we talk about this topic that you haven't talked about in a while. And here's why, how I'm going to provide value to your audience. And so I'm like making a pitch back to them. That's one big way I do it. And then the other is through guests on my show and then through other shows that I've been on. Don't just leave it at that. Like follow up, say thanks, reach out on Instagram, send a voicemail, keep the connection up. And now all of a sudden you have a exponentially growing network of friends who will help each other out. And one day somebody will come along and say, hey, I had this guy on my podcast. I think it'd be a good fit for yours. You want him to come on? And it becomes almost effortless at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that like collaboration can get you so far. And I wanted to ask, so obviously when you're assessing whether or not to suggest a podcast swap, what is the kind of criteria you look for? Is there a case that like you might see a show and think, you know what, they're not really at the level where I feel like a swap would be beneficial or would be a good investment of my time, or maybe their show's not of that quality? Are there certain things which make you kind of decline doing that swap, or are you open to like anything or whatever?
Well, I'm open to anything, but then once it comes through, I do say no. And I think you have personal experience with this. We don't have to name names, but like, I think that's how we connected, right? Was somebody what for me wasn't perfectly aligned on my show, keeping in mind that I try to limit at most one guest a week, and I have a backlog. So part of it is just numbers, right? It's like, I can't just say yes to everybody. But if the audiences are aligned and not too competitive, I hate to use that word because I think 90% of the time that's not ever going to be the case. Even if it's another nutrition coach and I'm a nutrition coach, we can still help each other out, and the listener will gravitate to who they like and who they want to listen to. And they can follow us both. It's fine. It's perfectly fine. So I think your answer was, do I ever think it's not a good fit? And sure, it could be it could be not a good fit, and I'll let them know. But then can I help you out in some other way?
Okay, yeah, that's cool. I think value first, you mentioned that as being really important. And yeah, to give listeners context, I did send Philip a pitch and it wasn't a right fit. I think Philip mentioned he was looking for podcast swaps and my guest couldn't offer a podcast swap. But I have to say, I really appreciated you responding. And as bizarre it sounds, like whenever I get rejection, it's actually kind of nice because so often you hear crickets. And I feel that when someone takes the time to explain like why it's not a good fit, for me, at least it signifies that your pitch was worth responding to. Because like if you get a really bad pitch and it's obvious it's a copy and paste job, no one's going to feel the sensational need, at least from my experience, to like respond to that. Whereas if you've kind of connected with the host or the person that you're speaking to a bit, if they take the time to explain it, say it's not a good fit right now, and then you can always ask like, okay, ask for feedback or ask when would be a good time, or if it's just simply not a good fit, just drop it and say thank you for their time. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's so true because I probably get a few pitches a day, and a lot of them are immediate deletes because you could tell it's like, hey, I love your podcast, comma, different font size, and then the entire name of my podcast, which nobody would ever say the whole thing, comma, and I'm like, no, right there you've lost me because there's zero time you've invested into this. Whereas yours was more personal. You suggested a topic, all those things. And I think you even tried to make a swap work because the person had like an Instagram live, but then the actual topic and their values weren't quite aligned with mine. Like, and I'm not going to name that particular one, but if somebody is coming in to talk about yoga these days on my show, there's a good chance they're probably not going to get on. It's not because I have a problem with yoga. It's just I have 10 other guests that are maybe more toward the strength training and kind of nutrition side that I'm trying to talk about these days. So, it's nothing personal, right?
Yeah, a lot of the time we're pitching, and this is why like sometimes it's easy just to send it and forget about it until you got to do the follow-ups, of course. But it's important to understand that so much it comes down to timing. Like even just landing in the person's inbox and it could be like their mood. Maybe they're in a good mood that day and like, you know what, I will speak to that person. And you just can't take it personally like that. So that's really great that you brought that up. And with regards to the guests that you source for your show, do they all come from pitches or do you have other methods of sourcing them?
These days, most are not through pitches. Most of them are me reaching out. So it's kind of flipped. It used to be a lot of pitches. I was on Podmatch, I was Matchmaker, all the services, and then get a lot of pitches through agencies, which I still do. And I still say yes to some of those, but a lot of them are like big names that I follow that I really think my audience would be psyched about and that I would think never would say yes. That's who I go after. And then half the time they say yes. So if you've got 10 of those people and you reach out with a personal pitch for them to be on your show, which is a lot easier than pitching to be on a show. Trust me. People love to be on shows. And even if you get a few of those, you're like, this is incredible. Let's do it. And then you better get to work and do a really great interview for that guest.
What do you look for in the guest? Obviously, you said it can vary from time to time depending on what you're looking for. But are there common aspects that you look out for in a guest generally go for?
Yeah, if you're talking about like general principles and attributes, I mean, I'm a big fan of, for our show, education and practicality, applying principles of fitness to your life in a kind of a niche area. So these days, like I try not to accept fitness coaches who are just generic, 25-year-old fitness coaches, but rather, hey, this person's an expert in gut health, or this person, I have somebody coming on who she trains only men and her whole thing is getting you increased testosterone so you can perform in the bedroom via your training. And I'm like, okay, these are cool little detailed angles and they're not really super competitive with me and my audience, but they're aligned with my audience or me and my coaching, but they're aligned with my audience. So that's kind of what it is. And then obviously, not obviously, I would say the, bigger and more well-known, the investment of time pays off in terms of, okay, they share with their audience. They have a big following. You're borrowing their audience as well by having them as a guest on your show. But I will say that's not a be all end all. I've had guests with, 200 followers on Instagram, but it'll perform really well because they love the topic and the guests and the quality and all that.
That's great to hear because I think some people do think it's a barrier of entry when they want to guest on a podcast thinking, I don't have the social media, I don't have the online following. Yeah. And so often I tell them it's like, the host will always value what you have to say and the experience and insights that you bring over like, oh, I've got 100,000. That's great. Don't get me wrong. It's a social currency that does have value, but it's not the most valuable thing.
If I could add to that, I think my very first guest appearance ever was on a much bigger show than mine. And it was through a collaboration where I paid for her to do a host read ad for me on her show. We hit it off with a conversation and I said, why don't you come on my show? Are you good? And she's like, yeah, I would love to. And then she did well on the show. We had chemistry and she's like, why don't you come on mine? So you don't force it. Sometimes it just naturally leads there if you, again, lead with value and it works itself out.
Yeah. And you said there, right, that you had like a paid promotion in that sense. Have you used much paid promotion or advertising or social media ads at all to boost your show?
I've dabbled, but not very extensively. The only one I've found successful modestly is the types of advertising where like a page is set up and they track IAB downloads, official downloads from legitimate listeners, and you're paying per download. But even then, I don't know if the ratio of, payment to downloads is worth it in that case. Other than that, I have tried Facebook and Instagram ads. I just haven't put too much into it, to be honest. And it'd be cool to know if people do get success growing their podcast that way. I've heard time and again, not necessarily. Like it's more the organic and getting on other shows and developing relationships where it really takes off. I want to let you know about a free resource I have. They are free guides on everything from fat loss to eating out to building muscle to managing hunger to figuring out the best macros for you and more. You want to get the most out of these podcasts and your time to look and feel your best, and these free guides will give you a quick and easy way to know what to do. If you want to get your hands on these completely free guides, you can head over to witsandweights.com/free to get your free guides and level up your results today.
Yeah. From my experience, that is the case. I think it's organic growth. I'm obviously biased in like the fact that I love podcast guesting, the foundation of our company. So of course, yeah.
But it works. It works.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it does. Yeah.
Yeah. And let me add to that. I mean, you can definitely go on the wrong shows and waste a lot of time guesting if you're just like splattering out your pitches everywhere. Like you do have to do a little bit of work up front.
Yeah.
At the same time, if your goal is just to practice a lot, that could work. If that's your goal right now, it's just to practice, that could work.
That's good. Certainly when people start out, I've also said to, given the advice that if you are starting out and you want practice, even doing Instagram lives or Facebook lives to your own audience, even if you've got a small audience, that's a great way to start and then get on to smaller shows.
Yeah, because that's nerve-wracking. Yeah. That's nerve-wracking for people, I can do it fine now, but you're right. Like early on, you're like the technology and how many people are going to show up. And I've got to make sure to follow there's a lot at play. And then a podcast is easy at that point. You're just chatting over a mic.
Yeah. And I like the idea that I'm assuming it's your audience, so they're going to be more receptive of you.
And that too. Good point. Yes.
So that's awesome. So you obviously mentioned that you started Wits and Weights more as like a passion project, and then it grew into you being able to monetize it with coaching. I'd love to know, like from an overall perspective, how have you been able to monetize Wits and Weights, and how has this kind of like changed since starting the show? Yeah,
I mean, it's been monetized exclusively via coaching for me. So I haven't even tried sponsorships, affiliates, advertising. If I do that, it will be very intentional and like curated. I'll do some curated sponsorships if it makes sense, where you can make a lot more than just the standard CPM. So I haven't even tried that, mainly because the volume of my show, even though I understand that's not the only variable. So with coaching, it took a while to kind of get my sea legs on that, but I realized that growing my email list seems to be a nice entry point to growing a very loyal audience that can hear my offers. When I'm ready, I provide value, offer, value, offer, kind of the Hormozy way, right? And so how do you do that? How do you grow your email list? One simple way is, let's say you're going to prepare for a podcast episode and you've got some notes. You can turn those notes into a guide, like a Google Doc guide, and make it an opt-in. And now you've already done the work anyway. Now you just do a few extra clicks here and get it up on a landing page, which, understood, if you haven't done that before, could be overwhelming. But you do that. And then in the episode, your call to action a couple of times is, hey, by the way, if you want to follow along, I have a detailed guide for you. Go, click on my show notes or go to witsandweights.com/free, and it's up there. And then that gets people on your email list, right? And it's exactly the audience you want on your email list. So I've grown my email list by, 5-6x in the last year. It's still not huge, but it was tiny, and now it's modest. So it's growing.
How frequently do you put out posts on to your email list?
3 to 5 times a week.
Okay.
So almost daily, but not quite.
Okay. So you got 3 to 5 times a week with the email list, and then you've got 3 episodes going out a week, you mentioned, with the podcast.
Yeah, and it was 5 for the last 6 months or so. It was 5 episodes. And just last week, I reduced it to 3. I kind of made that decision of quality over quantity, and plus my time.
How did you manage your time? Like, how did you manage to do all of that? Like, that sounds like so intense.
It's stressful. It is. It really is. And that's why, like, rule number 1, and you've probably talked about this before, is when people say, how often should I do my podcast? It's like, whatever works for you, start there as rule number 1, whatever works for you, where it's achievable and you can be consistent 100% of the time. And that might be once a month. That might be once every other week. I initially started every other week. Then I went to once a week. Then I went to twice a week. And I only did that because I had this huge backlog of interviews and I wanted to get the guests out and not make them wait a year. And then once I had that cadence of 2 a week, which was reasonable for me, I said, why don't I add 2 more? And I called them quick wits. They were short, like 4 or 5 minutes, almost unscripted. It was from my data dump of ideas I got throughout the week. I have 1,000 ideas for podcast episodes at this point. And I'm like, how do I get them all out? Okay, I'm going to talk about creatine on this one. And then I'm going to talk about women loading their spine on this one. Like all these little belief shifts. And I think people liked it, but I also think it's overwhelming when you put out so much content and now people are trying to catch up with that on your feed. And I do have a couple of the coaches, including a podcast coach, who's like, look, you may be overwhelming to them to the point where they don't even want to reach out for coaching because they feel like they have to get caught up first with your library. I'm like, that's interesting. And I was sacrificing quality too. So having said all that, if you can find the right balance between quantity, quality, and your goals, like what is your goal? Is it conversion? Is it growth? Some blend of the two? Are you trying to climb the charts? Because there are ways to game the system. Let's be honest. You can in the short term that could be helpful long term. And I'm not against any of that. It's just what's your goal?
That's understandable. And do you use any kind of tools to make your process more efficient? Do you use AI or anything like that?
I'm a very efficient guy, like probably obsessively, neurotically so compared to the average person. I'm an engineer by background. I'm a type A. I'm using all these identity statements, but they're 100% true. I'm a perfectionist. Like when you add all that together and see how organized I am with my inbox and my calendar, it kind of makes sense that I can somehow make the impossible work and stretch it along. But there's stress there behind that. There's a lot of like physical and mental stress behind that. So yes, systems and checklists and processes are going to pay off big time, as long as you don't then say, oh, now I've freed up more time that I'm going to fill up and do 3 more episodes. Because that's kind of how I do it. I'm like, now I have time, I can do more. But having a simple checklist, it doesn't have to be complicated. I know everybody loves these like Notion and everything else, which I think are great, but a simple spreadsheet. Just take what you do in the 4 or 5 hours prepping for your podcast, however long it takes, and just systematize it, write it down, put it in a sheet, like put it in a spreadsheet as checklist items. One by one, as you move through your process, automate each of those like as best you can or eliminate them, right? That's kind of the approach I would take, is just do what you do, write it down, and now try to make it more efficient.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you've made a lot of changes within the past year or so. What would you say has probably been the biggest or most impactful change that you've implemented?
Okay, let me lay it out. I actually did make quite a few changes in the last couple months to my show. I updated the packaging, not the cover art, but the title and subtitle, my name, the show description, like all thinking about keywords, SEO, ideal client, those sorts of things. I think that's important. It's not a throwaway. I really honed in on episode titles, making them really good hooks, the show notes, really good hooks. And then the structure of my show has been revamped as well as the music. So I used to have either a pull quote from an interview, which I'm not a big fan of doing that anymore, or I'd have a custom teaser. Now I do a custom teaser. Then I'd have the music, which was this long, like minute-long pre-recorded music with me talking. And then the intro, and the intro was often quite long before I got to the good stuff. Now I have a short, like 45-second punchy teaser. It's a hook. It's a story. It's like, here's what you're struggling with. I'm going to give you the answer here. Stick around. And then the music is maybe 30 seconds long without me talking and overlapping the teaser and the intro. And so it's cool, like techie, like techno, geeky, sciencey music now, or as it used to be the classic American fitness rock, right? Okay. And the funny thing is, as I was selecting new music, another guy, he's a Brit as well, right? We gave each other podcast feedback, and he's like, yeah, it just sounds like every other American fitness podcast, like the music. I said, well, you're in luck because I had just changed it. What do you think? He's like, oh yeah, that's much better. So I changed the music, and then the intro after the music, I really get into it fast. I want to get right to some value to the listener, and then make a very short call to action, and then continue with lots of value. The other thing I did, this is even more profound, is I'm moving away from how-to educational and more to what is my worldview, what is my concept and philosophy, and how is it like completely different than any other podcast, which for me is applying the world of engineering to fitness and like building your best system to build your best physique, as opposed to just check, do these, eat this much protein, do this much, lift this much weight. So I just gave you a lot so we can drill into any one of those. But yeah, now that you maybe think about it, there's a lot that's changed.
That's awesome because there is no shortage of like health and wellness podcasts out there. So I think understanding what makes you different and understanding like what's going to set you apart it seems like that was that a big part of the process going through this, thinking like, how am I going to differentiate myself?
100%. So one of my coaches, his name is Jeremy Enns. You might have heard of him.
Yeah, I'm friends with him. I know.
Yeah, Jeremy. So he uses the term onlyness. Like, what is the onlyness of your podcast? If you had to use one sentence to describe your podcast in a way that no one else could possibly have that characteristic, what would it be? Right. And I don't know that I've come up with that one statement necessarily, but if you look at my show notes, and you kind of alluded to it in my introduction, it's like being smart and efficient and kind of applying this engineering approach to your fitness.
Yeah, I got that. I could feel that. I see that, like that engineering aspect come through a lot. And you are obviously focusing on a lot right now, or you've previously gone through a lot when it comes to changes with the show. What are you focusing on in the future? Like, what's your next ambition for Wits and Weights moving forward?
I mean, I want to play out with the changes I've made and collect data. So I've focused on creating some attribution for the podcast, like using custom links. And when I have somebody join my program, one of the first questions in the survey is, how did you find me? And was it through the podcast? Like little things like that to ensure a link between my funnel or whatever phrase you like. And then kind of tracking and measuring that, not being impatient, but giving it time to play out. Where I am now is I see a lot of podcasts at this stage where they grow, and then they start to plateau a bit. And I've had a few plateaus along the way. My first plateau was early on, and I broke through that with collaborations. Later on the plateau, I broke through both volume and having bigger guests, right? And like, so each of those pieces I can kind of tie to the data. And now I'm like, oh, I've had like a month or two that dipped a little bit. It was like 22,000 this month, then it was 19, and then it was 20, and then 18. And you doubt yourself, but then you realize, no, even in podcasting, it's cyclical in some sense. Certain months are going to perform better than others throughout the year. Especially the summer with fitness is kind of tough because people are like taking off, and it's not like January where everybody's just, oh, I'm going to lose weight. So you got to pay attention to data, but not overanalyze or give it too much credence. And so I want to kind of break through that barrier. But before I do, I needed to put in place the quality, the differentiation, the onlyness, and really tie it into what I do in my coaching and see how the conversion improves before I start to scale again.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've noticed throughout this conversation, just generally our interactions, is I really appreciate how much you value feedback. And you are such a fan of feedback in the sense like you offer me feedback for the show, which I really love. And I'm the same. I really enjoy it because I don't feel like you can improve or get as far as fast without being open to feedback or even like seeking it out. Do you ask your audience for feedback? And if so, how have you been successful at like getting it or receiving it?
Yeah, that's a good one, because asking for things from your audience is something a lot of podcasters don't do. And that could be not just asking with calls to action, like to download something, but it could be asking them to reach out, asking them to vote on this or this. I'm using a new title. Do you like this or this? Having a community where they can do that, like a Facebook community or something else, where you could just reach out and say, hey, this is happening on the show. You guys are the first to know. What do you think about blah, blah, blah? And then you could even go bigger than that, like a survey. So I did do a survey early in the year, and I offered some little prizes, like some supplements or a gift card, something like that, like 5, random prizes to the top winners. And I got like 50 responses, which was amazing, right? Because that's a good data size, as long as the survey is constructed really well. So I'm a big fan of that. And when people give you a 1-star review, that's really good feedback too. Trust me. No, it really is. It's good feedback, because I've had a few of those that First of all, don't overplay a 1-star review. Trust me, we give negative feedback way too much weight versus positive. But there's something in there, some truth in there potentially that you can glean value from, and just gotta let it rub off. Like, don't take it personally, and look for the opportunity to grow.
Yeah. And then how did you analyze the data that you got from this form?
Yeah. So because I had so many responses, I didn't want to take too much time trying to pour through everything. So I used AI. I think I used like ChatGPT or Claude. I downloaded the results in spreadsheet form, dumped it in there, and I asked it a bunch of prompts like, give me the pros and cons, give me the patterns, give me the demographics. What are listeners, what do they love? What do they want to change? And then I took all that and I also made an episode on it. And that was one of my bonus episodes. So it's probably worth me actually going back again, looking at the data and seeing, is there anything I haven't already acted upon? Because that's still good data. Or have I addressed things that I can go back to my audience and say, hey, you asked for this, here's what we've been doing. So kind of, I'm glad you brought it up.
That's fantastic. Obviously we mentioned AI is still not always perfect with its response. And did you find it ran relatively smoothly, or was there a lot of kind of like, did you get quite hands-on to sort it all out?
I think because it's language, these are language processing AI, and you're dealing with objective data, you're giving it a ton of high quality information to work from, as opposed to when somebody uses AI and like, hey, make me a podcast episode about XYZ, and you're kind of lazy about it. And now you're just relying on all the generic information that's out there in the learning model. So the more information you give it, the more specific your prompt. I think the more you can quote unquote trust it. Now you should double check if there's any like squirrely, results that don't make sense. But I did go in back and look at the data. I'm like, what do they mean there? Just to see. And that more than likely caused me to improve how I asked the AI to give me the, not so much whether it was right or wrong. Yeah.
I love this idea of doing the survey. Do you ever elicit in other forms? Like, do you ask them to reach out via email? Obviously they've left comments, and have you got many other people, obviously, other than the people you mentioned at the start where they say you changed my life? Are you managing to like get emails from them?
Yeah. Emails and Instagram DMs. I'll get video. I love audio and video messages too when people do that. And trust me, even the biggest people, and I'm not big if you look at my IG following, but if you could have somebody with 300,000 followers, and assuming they're not a jerk, and they chances are if you reach out to them and it's not blocked in their other inbox, because that's the other problem.
Yeah.
A lot of them will respond, like they're humans too. And so it is awesome when somebody reaches out, because I will personally respond. I will send voice messages. I'll send a video back, and I'm not trying to sell you something. It's just like, hey, thanks for listening. Anything else I can help with? And then maybe there is something where I can give them another resource or guide. And that's how we build relationships. And ultimately, if you're in this for business, that's how you build legitimate sales through an authentic process.
Well, I have no more questions for you, Philip, but I have to say, I really do love that you take such an open approach. You're so self-aware, I think, in your process of podcasting. I'd highly recommend everyone goes and checks it out and gives it a good listen, and then offers a review, feedback, whatever to Philip. Yeah.
Either a 5-star review or send me a message if you don't think it deserves 5 stars, and I'll get it there for you.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that attitude. Where else can people find you, Philip, if they want to keep in touch with you?
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. Just the podcast, Wits and Weights, or go to Instagram, DM me at Wits and Weights, and you should be able to find everything you need there.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, Philip, once again, thank you for joining me and making this such an enjoyable conversation.
Likewise, Sam. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. All right, so that was it. My interview on the Mikes and Millions podcast. If you like this type of episode, let me know. Reach out on Instagram at Wits and Weights, or shoot me an email or text message. The best way to do that is in the show notes where it says, send me a text message. I'll talk to you next time on the Wits and Weights podcast.